In the early hours of the 20th of May 1941, over 500 heavily laden German transport planes took off from airfields in Attiki and Viotia and headed south over the Aegean. Along with 70 gliders, they carried the first wave of 13 parachute battalions who were tasked with capturing the Greek island of Crete. The Axis forces thought that the capture of Crete would be easy, but they had not reckoned on the fiercely independent Cretans, whose campaign of resistance turned their occupation into an absolute disaster. Until the spring of 1941, Crete had not featured prominently in either Allied or Axis war planning. Its principal strategic value was as a naval base and an aircraft carrier. From there, Allied bombers could attack the Romanian Ploiești oil fields on which Hitler's planned invasion of Russia depended. For Hitler, it was a stepping stone to North Africa and the Middle East. Otherwise, the island had little to offer. It had taken a great deal of persuasion to bring Hitler round to the view that Crete was worth the cost in lives and resources to take and hold. But Hitler's generals saw only the potential for victory over the British and unparalleled glory for their own forces. However, the strength of the British Navy in the Mediterranean made an airborne invasion inevitable. So the plan was formulated by the architect of the Luftwaffe's parachute division, General Kurt Student. His plan involved a series of airborne invasions of Crete, Cyprus, and finally the Suez Canal, timed to coincide with Rommel's occupation of Alexandria.
They're a bit like the Brits at Arnhem in '44. They were so keen to have a jump before the Germans won the war, and obviously they were going to win it by Christmas 1941, that Student with his Fliegerkorps wanted to get in on the action. He wanted to earn a place for his Fallschirmjäger to have the prime position in the Berlin Victory Parade.
The first phase of the plan involved a strike against the three airfields on the north coast of the island at Malmö, Rethymno and Heraklion, using paratroopers and glider-borne troops. Capturing and holding at least one of these airfields was the key to the success of the invasion. If the Germans could create an air bridge, they could use it to fly in reinforcements and supplies. Without it, the defending forces would mop up the first wave of attackers and the invasion would be doomed. Further paratroop units were to be dropped near the harbour at Southa and in the valley southwest of Hanya, known as Prison Valley, with the aim of taking strategic positions and tying down the defending forces. It was fine on paper, but the intelligence picture was murky and the risk of failure was high.
His plan is terrible because he hasn't got the intelligence that he needs. Unlike the British who have Ultra, Student is winging it.
Hitler allowed himself to be convinced, in spite of his prediction that there would be very heavy casualties, a prediction that was to prove accurate. The launch date for Operation Mercury was set for May the 17th. Crete was no stranger to invasion. Greece, Italy and Turkey had laid claim to the island at different periods in its history. Fiercely independent in spirit and deeply suspicious of foreigners, the Cretans had only finally accepted enosis, formal union with Greece, after the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. What helped to convince them was the existence of a reformist government in Athens, headed by the charismatic Cretan Republican Eleftherios Venizelos, who embodied the strong anti-royalist streak of the islanders. In the years between the world wars, the political scene in Greece had been chaotic, with Venizelists, the parties of the left, and the royalists who supported King Constantine locked in a turbulent struggle for power. Soon after Venizelos died in exile in Paris in 1936, King Constantine appointed Ioannis Metaxas Prime Minister. On the pretext of heading off a communist threat to seize power, Metaxas suspended the constitution and dissolved parliament. Effectively, Greece became a dictatorship with a ruthlessly efficient secret police force. By April 1939, the island had been placed under martial law, and Mussolini's forces had invaded Albania. 6 months later, he proposed a so-called peaceful occupation of Greece. Metaxas responded with a single word: no. 2.5 hours later, the Italian invasion force poured over the Albanian border into Greece. An operation launched by a nation of 43 million with a large modern mechanized army against a tiny country of 9 million with ill-equipped forces could have only one conclusion, except it didn't. In the rugged mountains of Epirus, the Greeks waited until the Italian forces were strung out in the narrow valleys below them, then let loose a deadly rain of mortars and artillery shells. The invaders were smashed where they stood. Demoralized, mired in mud, routed at every turn, they retreated. The Greeks chased them a quarter of the way back across Albania. Mussolini's dream of a cheap victory had turned into a nightmare. Back in Albania, while Greek forces were notching up astonishing successes against the Italians, Britain offered to take over the defense of Crete. Metaxas accepted, and battalions were dispatched to guard Suda Bay, the great natural harbour at Hania, dominated by Akrotiri. This released the 5th Cretan Division to go and fight the Italians in Albania in November 1940. Conditions were appalling during the worst winter in living memory. Resistance crumbled, and the British and Dominion troops who had been sent to support the Greeks fell back before the onslaught. It was a rout. 43,000 of them were evacuated, abandoning most of their equipment. By the end of April, the battle on the mainland was all over, and the swastika was flying over the Acropolis. One of the last senior Allied officers to leave the mainland was Major General Bernard Freyberg, commander of the New Zealand Division. He reached Crete on the 29th of April. He was Churchill's choice to lead the defense of Crete against the expected invasion. But he didn't want the job, and the resources at his disposal were dangerously inadequate.
What's he got? He's got about 35,000 odds and sods. About 15,000 of those are informed units, soldiers who've got some weapons, some equipment, and some organization, but the majority haven't. And you've got 400,000 Cretans. But you haven't got any real Greek soldiers. The Cretan division, the 5th division, are still in Albania fighting the Italians. And what you have here is about 10 or 13,000 conscripts.
One soldier of the Cretan division who had made it back to Crete before the invasion was Markos Richatos.
Εγώ όταν κατέβηκα από την Αλβανία, με άδεια 40 μέρες μου το έκανε, μου την ανακαλέσαν από το Ρέθενο, στο φρουραρχείο. Λοιπόν, πήγα στο φρουραρχείο να μου δώσουν όπλα και αυτό, αλλά δυστυχώς δεν είχαν όπλα και πήρα μια ζωστήρα και εγώ είχα προμηθευτεί ένα τουφέτσι δικό μου μαλισέρι και το χρησιμοποίησα εγώ αυτό, το μαλισέρι, στους Γερμανούς.
Richatos was fortunate to have a weapon at all. After the Cretan uprising against the Metaxas government in 1938, the population had been disarmed. Amid the chaotic period preceding the invasion, the Greek forces on the island played little part in Freyberg's thinking.
And so Freiberg suddenly finds he's got a real bugger's muddle, and he has to put it together in basically a month. A little bit less than a month, in fact, 3 weeks. But what he does know is ultra.
Decrypts of the German Enigma codes, known as Ultra, provided a remarkably accurate picture of the proposed attack from the air. But intelligence, however good, rarely gives a complete picture. Freiberg felt he also had to allow for the possible threat from the sea. For one thing, each of the 3 airfields targeted had a port nearby, which could obviously be used by the Germans for resupply once they'd won a foothold. But by deploying forces to protect the coast and defend beaches against a possible seaborne invasion, Freiberg weakened his defences against invasion from the air. His planning has since been subjected to strong criticism by some commentators.
Nonsense. Go out and look on the ground, and at Maleme you will see that Hagest's brigade is sighted to defend the airfield. And it does it very effectively when on the 20th everything starts. In fact, on the 20th, the Germans are overconfident.
On the eve of the invasion, German intelligence stated that the British garrison on Crete was no more than 5,000 men, and that all the Australians and New Zealanders evacuated from mainland Greece had gone directly to Egypt. It was also confidently predicted that the civilian population would accord the invasion forces an enthusiastic welcome. As predictions go, it couldn't have been more wrong. On the morning of the 20th of May, shortly after 6 a.m., the German 8th Air Corps began bombing and strafing the coastal plain west of Souda Bay. They specially targeted the anti-aircraft positions around Maleme airfield. Shortly after the raid finished, the first wave of gliders swept in to land on the stony riverbed of the Tavranitis, west of Maleme airfield. And as they emerged from their gliders, many German troops were cut down by fire from the New Zealanders of the 22nd Battalion, sighted on the west of Hill 107, overlooking the riverbed. Close behind the gliders came the first of the Junkers 52 transports, packed with paratroopers.
And if you can imagine that, 300 feet, a slow angle over the coast, flying down the coast towards Maleme, flying down the valley over the prison, and suddenly the sky is dotted with the black parachutes of the paratroopers themselves and the multicolored parachutes, and of course they fly into a hornet's nest and they're cut to pieces.
The German paratroopers were desperately vulnerable while they were still in the air and immediately after landing, before they had had time to regroup and locate the canisters containing their equipment. They had depended on the element of surprise to buy them time. Dropping onto prepared defensive positions, they had no chance. Athanasios Yakumakis, who was a child at the time, was trapped in a nearby vineyard when the paratroopers started dropping from the sky all around him.
Εγώ όπως ήμουν τώρα με τα μπελόφυλλα, λέω τι να κάνω τώρα μόνος με εκεί στο αμπέλι. Ήταν ένα χαντάκι, ένας λάκκος εκεί. Ξαπλώνω στο λάκκο και περίμενε να τελειώσει, να λήξει ο βομβαρδισμός και συνεχεία βέβαια οι αλεξιπτωτιστές. Όταν είδα εγώ τους αλεξιπτωτιστές, σκεπάστηκα με κάτι κλίματα για να μην με δούνε. Αλλά εντωμεταξύ πέφτανε συνέχεια. Ένας Γερμανός έπεσε στα 2-3 μέτρα μπροστά μου, αλλά όπως ήμουνα σκεπασμένος με τα κλίματα του αμπελιού δεν με είδε. Και ευτυχώς που δεν με είδε, γιατί αν με έβλεπε νόμιζε ότι θα ήμουν και αυτό. Εκεί ήμουνα τώρα ξαπλωμένος με τα κλίματα από το πρωί μέχρι το βράδυ, μέχρι σχεδόν ηλιοβασιλέματα.
Brigadier Eugen Meindl of the Storm Regiment, landing to the west of Hill 107, quickly realized that the hill was the key to the airfield and concentrated his attacks in that area. The battalion attacking from the riverbed lost 16 officers, while Meindl himself was wounded twice in the course of an hour. All attempts to take the hill in the course of the first day failed.
If you can imagine the situation around Malemi, there were people all over the place. There were German paratroopers trying desperately to link up with someone who wouldn't shoot at them. There were RAF members from the aerodrome desperately trying to get out the way. There were lost New Zealanders, and there were Cretans. The local Cretans came down from the hills, dug up the ancient shotguns out of the gardens, all with their picks or their knives, coming into the action.
The part played by Cretan civilians in the first day's fighting was a foretaste of what the invaders could expect in the years to come. Far from greeting the paratroopers warmly, as German intelligence had predicted, they attacked them ferociously with whatever weapons came to hand. Men, women, children, even priests were involved in the fighting. For the Cretans, from the first hours of the invasion, it was war to the knife.
Και γι' αυτό θεώρησαν ότι δεν είναι δυνατόν να υποταχθούν σε ένα εχθρό ο οποίος ήθελε πάλι να τους επιβάλλει να χάσουν την ελευθερία τους. Και με όποιο τρόπο μπόρεσαν, αντιστάθηκαν είτε με όπλα παλιάς βεβαίως τεχνολογίας, είτε με την κατσούνα, με πέτρες, με τσεκούρια, με οποιοδήποτε τρόπο, εν πάση περιπτώσει, μπόρεσαν να αντισταθούν στους Γερμανούς.
Athanasios Yakumakis, who had been captured by the paratroopers but escaped, went in search of his father, who'd been involved in the fighting.
Τι να δω πάλι εκεί, καμιά δεκαριά σκοτωμένοι ανθρώποι, παραμορφωμένοι, γιατί από τη μια μεριά βάζανε τα πολυβόλα και από την άλλη μεριά χειρογοβίδες. Και ήταν όλοι παραμορφωμένοι όλοι. Τους έπιανα από τα μαλλιά και τους σήκωνα έτσι για να βρω τον πατέρα μου. Σε κάποια στιγμή, πάρα δίπλα τώρα, καμιά δεκαριά μέτρα, ήταν ένα άλλο γεφυράκι, φρακαρωτό, μικρό, και ακούω μια φωνή και λέει «Θανάση, εσύ είσαι?» Και ήταν ο πατέρας μου. Του λέω «Μπα, εσύ είσαι?» «Ναι». Αμέσως λοιπόν φεύγουμε από εκεί, σιγά σιγά κατορθώνουμε να φύγουμε από τον κύκλο που πέφτανε οι αλεξιπτοδιστές. Μάλιστα έτσι καθώς βαδίζαμε, έτυχε να πέφτουν μπροστά μας και κάναμε έτσι μια καρά, παράκαμψη και φύγαμε και πήγαμε τώρα 10 χιλιόμετρα που ήταν η υπόλοιπη οικογένεια.
At Rethymno, 2 Australian battalions commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Ian Campbell had taken up positions on hills overlooking the airfield and on another coastal hill closer to the town. When the German Junkers 52 troop carriers appeared at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they followed the line of the coast road, exposing them to withering fire. At Evacuation, the third of the airfields targeted in students' invasion plans, Brigadier Chappell commanded a mixed force of Australian, Greek and British regiments, including the Black Watch, who were tasked with defending the airfield itself. They met the German transports with fierce anti-aircraft fire, shooting down 15 in 2 hours. Large numbers of paratroopers were shot before they even reached the ground. One battalion managed to fight its way into the town of Evacuation in spite of fierce resistance by Greek troops and irregulars, but were forced to withdraw after a strong counterattack by the Leicesters and the York and Lancaster regiment. The German commander vowed that as soon as his troops were clear of the city, he would call on the Luftwaffe to destroy it. 4 days later, the threat was carried out. But the invaders had achieved none of the objectives of Operation Mercury. Close to 2,000 paratroopers had been killed and many others were lost or dispersed. Student was under strong pressure to abort the whole operation, but he decided on one last throw. From reports on the ground, he knew that Hill 107 was the key to controlling Malmö airfield. After disastrous losses, his effective fighting force there now numbered less than 60. But if he could land and deploy fresh troops, there was a chance that the hill could be taken and the airfield would fall.
And he sends in a lone Ju-52 with one of his staff officers on board to test the Malemi aerodrome. It lands, it comes under scattered fire and takes off. That's all that Student needs.
What Student did not know on the night of the 20th was that, even as he was making his plans, a fatal decision was being taken on Crete. Shortly before nightfall, the commander on the spot at Maleme, Colonel Andrews, who had lost touch with his forward units on the airfield and on the western slopes of Hill 107, he became convinced, wrongly in fact, that his forward units had been overrun. Reluctantly, he decided that he had no option but to extricate the remainder of his forces before daylight.
And that night, even though his battalion is not in contact, he withdraws his battalion off the vital ground. And Crete is lost from that moment.
Later that night, discovering themselves abandoned, the forward units on the airfield and the side of the hill had no choice but to fall back. By dawn, the remains of the German Storm Regiment had taken control of Hill 107.
It's not until 5 o'clock in the afternoon of the 21st that the first wave of transport aircraft start landing at Maleme. And there's the biggest aircraft traffic jam in the Mediterranean. But Student takes a gamble and it works. And yet, right throughout that day, had Hagest seized the initiative, looked at his battalions that were still in place and counterattacked, then we would have been looking at a different story.
By the end of the second day, Student had his air bridge in place. Troop carriers began to arrive every few minutes. Men and supplies poured into Crete to relieve his hard-pressed paratroopers. Freiburg's counterattack, when it finally came, failed. The tide had turned decisively against the defenders. By the 26th, it was clear to Freiburg that there was only one option open to him, and that was a withdrawal, a fighting withdrawal back through Hanya, holding Suda Bay for the last moment, and then over the White Mountains to Sfakia on the south coast, where the Navy could take them to safety. For his men, the weary march across the island under constant attack by the Luftwaffe was hell.
Εδώ είναι το φαράγγι της Νίμπρος Σφακείο. Εδώ τα κυνηγούσαν τα γερμανικά αεροπλάνα, τα αγγλικά στρατεύματα. Περνώντας από εδώ, οι Γερμανοί με τα αεροπλάνα κοιτάζανε πας στη Σία να κόψουν τη διάβαση. Ένα γερμανικό αεροπλάνο Στούκας κυνηγούσε τους Άγγλους, περνώντας από παρακάτω, το ρίξανε, φτώνανε οι Άγγλοι με το μπρέντ, με το μπρέντι και πήρε φωτιά. Και έπεσανε, φλέγονται και έπεσε σε αυτό το σημείο εδώ. Θυμάμαι τον πιλότο του αεροπλάνου, τον είχαν εδώ θαμένο. Μετά κατά την Κρήτη τον πήραν οι Γερμανοί και τον πήγαν στα, δεν ξέρω, μάλλον στα Χανιά τον πήγαν. Και το θυμάμαι εδώ και ήταν όταν και μπαράς και τώρα σαν να είναι χθες αυτό το πράγμα. Αυτά το θυμούμε. Ήταν γεμάτο στρατέματα εδώ με μάχες, σκληρές μάχες γίνονταν. Από τα Χανιά μέχρι τη χώρα του έγιναν σκληρές μάχες εδώ. Ναι.
Despite the magnificent efforts of the Royal Navy to take the defeated troops off, over 5,000 men were left behind to become prisoners of war, and many were lost as the ships heading for Alexandria came under savage attack by Stukas.
Crete could have been an outstanding success, but it wasn't. It was another failure, and really, when you talk to the veterans, both Cretan, New Zealander, Australian, British, whatever, it's like a canker that eats at their souls because they know that man for man, they had beaten the Fallschirmjäger, they had beaten the cream of the German army, and yet somehow they had lost, and they couldn't explain it.
It was a bitter end to a bitter experience. But the battle for Crete was far from over. For the Cretans and a handful of agents on the island, it was about to enter its second phase. The period immediately after the surrender of the British and Dominion forces in Crete was one of confusion and consolidation. While the Germans were establishing control in the western end of the island, their Italian allies occupied the eastern provinces of Scythia and Lacethi. Meanwhile, the Germans rounded up the scattered remnants of the Allied forces and herded them back across the island from the beaches at Sfakia. 10-year-old Georgios Hadjithakis watched them go.
Οι Άγγλοι εμένανε και τους θάβανε οι δικοί μας, οι Έλληνες. Και θυμάμαι και τους γυρίζανε πίσω οι Γερμανοί τους εχμαλούς και εδώ στο Ασκήφου σταματήσα 1-2 μέρες και θυμάμαι και ακόμα από τις μουρνιές στο μουρνούφυλλο και το τρώγα, ενώ ήταν ο τόπος γεμάτος από μπισκότα, κονσέρβες αγγλικές εγκατελειμμένες.
Those who were incarcerated in the prison camp at Hania found that the guards were often lax in their duties. A number of them escaped and took refuge with the villagers, who showed typical Cretan hospitality and welcomed them in, concealing them from the Germans. At Floria, where a German patrol had been ambushed several days after the invasion, one monument records the names of the Germans who were killed in the action, and another the Cretans who fell on that day. Beside them are the names of their family members and comrades who died in the following months. Astonished and appalled by the fierce reception their paratroopers had received at the hands of Cretan civilians and partisans, the Germans adopted a policy of harsh repression, hoping to cow the local population by the sheer brutality of their reprisals.
Όταν πέσανε οι Γερμανοί στις 20 του Μάη του 1941, στις 22 περάσαν για την Παλιόχώρα. Επειδή τους χτυπήσανε στα Φλόρια και στην Κάδανο και είχαν απώλειες, όταν επιστρέφανε, εξεσπάσανε στο χωριό εδώ πέρα. Εκάψανε 3 μαγαζιά, σκοτώσανε 6 άτομα σε ένα σπίτι. Εδώ πέρα είναι. Μεταξύ των οποίων ήταν και ένα παιδί 2 χρονών. 2 και κάτι μέσα.
At Asteri, a strong German detachment arrived before dawn on June the 1st, cordoned off the village and rounded up the male population. Some were made to stand facing a wall in the middle of the village, while others were marched off to a nearby hill and forced to dig a communal grave. Before the job could be completed, one of the men escaped, and the soldiers immediately rounded up the remainder and took them to another spot south of the village.
Τους έστασαν, τους πήραν φωτογραφίες και με τα πολυβόλα τους εγκρέμισαν από κάτω. Δεν ήταν στο ύψος αυτό, να πούμε, 2,5 μέτρα ήταν το ύψος, ήταν μεγάλο. Εγώ ακολουθούσα από πίσω, διότι ήταν ο πατέρας μέσα, κάτι θείοι μου κλπ. Χωριανοί βέβαια. Και από μακριά, αφού έφυγε και ο τελευταίος Γερμανός ο οποίος έδωσε τη χαριστική βολή, εγώ πήγα και είδα το σώρο των πτωμάτων κλπ. Και ζητούσα τον πατέρα. Ο πατέρας φαίνεται είχε κάνει κάποια απόπειρα να φύγει και ήταν κάπου 7 μέτρα πιο μακριά από το σώρο. Τελικά τους θάψαμε αμέσως και υπό το φόβο όλο το χωριό άδειασε και τραβήξαμε στα ψηλά χωριά, στα ορεινά μέρη.
The only villagers who remained were a few elderly people, including the grandparents of Markos Poliathakis. When 2 heavily armed Germans turned up in the village some days later, his grandmother reacted in a manner that is wholly typical of the Cretan spirit.
Όταν φτάνανε στο σημείο που είστε αυτού, αυτή εξανέστη βέβαια, άναψαν τα αίματά της, ήταν και πολύ δυναμική γυναίκα, έξυπνη και δυναμική, άρπαξε λοιπόν ένα ξύλο από εδώ και το φέρνει του Γερμανού στο κεφάλι. Αρπακτήκανε στα χέρια και μετά κάποια στιγμή που την απόθυσε, ο άλλος ο σύντροφος από δίπλο με το ταχυβόλο τη γάζωσε και πήγε προς το σπίτι και έπεσε στην πόρτα. Ακούει τη φασαρία ο παππούς απ' έξω από εκεί το περβολάκι και κατεβαίνοντας στο τελευταίο σκαλοπάτι του βάζει πάλι ο άλλος με το ταχυβόλο και τον σκοτώνει. Ο σκύλος απ' έξω χαλούσε τον κόσμο, γαμπίσματα κλπ. Σκοτώνουν το σκύλο, δίνουν φωτιά στο σπίτι, διότι και σε όλα τα σπίτια του χωριού. Το χωριό κάητσανε κατά 95%, 5 σπίτια μείναν, δεν μείναν τίποτα άλλο. Και μετά εσπούσανε τα πιθάρια, τα λάδια, τα ξύδια, τα κρασιά, όλα στους δρόμους κλπ. Πήραν ό,τι θέλανε, τα πιο καλά πράγματα κλπ.
Thus, the pattern was set that defined the relationship between the occupying German troops and the Cretan population for the remainder of the occupation. Cretan civilians were never forgiven by their new masters for failing to conform to the benign behaviour predicted by their faulty intelligence.
There were extremely strict rules applied by the Germans. Any attack on a German soldier, there were ghastly reprisals. And this was well known both to the Cretans, who didn't much care about it, and to the British, who were trying to get Cretan resistance organised. The Germans had a rule that if you killed a German, they killed 50 of you. And this Gastewerdsans was applied quite often. Consequently, the Germans in Crete were not popular with the Cretans. Do you wonder?
A plaque erected at the time justified harsh retaliation for the so-called bestial murder of 25 German soldiers and paratroopers at the hands of men, women, children, and a priest. The bodies of paratroopers who had been shot in the air or died falling into trees were later found to have lost their eyes. In all probability, crows were to blame, but the villagers were accused of mutilating the corpses. Kandanos, along with the villages of Skiki and Prasos, were burnt to the ground in retaliation. For the Germans, the Cretan civilians who took up arms against them were terrorists. Cretans see it differently.
Ο κάθε πατριώτης έχει την ιερή υποχρέωση, και προπαντός οι Έλληνες που έχουμε μακρά ιστορία, να υπερασπιστούμε την πατρίδα μας. Αυτό κάμανε και οι δικοί μου άνθρωποι, οι χωριανοί μου, οι συγγενείς μου, οι πατριώτες μου, όλοι οι Κρητικοί. Μετά ακολούθησαν 4 χρόνια φρικτής κατοχής. Όλοι οι πατριώτες σχεδόν μέχρι τέλους της κατοχής είχαν οργανωθεί σε οργανώσεις αντίστασης. Βοήθησαν την πατρίδα με κάθε τρόπο.
John Pendlebury, head of British Special Operations at the time of the invasion, had been killed in the fighting around Heraklion. But his strong conviction that Cretan irregulars could be a painful thorn in the flesh of the Germans was shared by all those who followed him. A regular stream of SOE agents shuttled back and forth between North Africa and Crete. One vital, if unglamorous, aspect of clandestine activities was intelligence gathering. Zan Fielding, based near Hanya, began to transmit to Cairo information on air and sea movements, assisted by a small group of Cretans who took great risks to collect information on gun positions, airfields, and every ship loading or unloading in the harbours on the north coast. This information would be transmitted by a string of wireless operators. Often they had to put up with loneliness and appalling conditions, living in caves or holes with a ground sheet for protection. Wirelesses, especially batteries, were unreliable. When they went wrong, a runner would be dispatched across the mountains to fetch another set. One of these was 17-year-old George Sikundakis.
Ο πρώτο με δρομολογιό ήταν και πήγα στον Πλάτανο Μαρίου. Ο Πλάτανος είναι πιο πέρα από το Φουρφουρά και κοπήκα τα πόδια μου. Δεν μπορώ πιο να περπατήσω πέσα κάτω. Του λέω δεν μπορώ. Η πρώτη φορά στη ζωή μου που κουράστηκα και το πρώτο δρομολόγιο. Από τότε άρχισα, εμέτρησα μέχρι 27 δρομολόγια, 28. Και πολλές φορές σκέφτομαι όπως παίρνουν τσιβουλοκορφές και κάθιζα σε ένα μέρος στον Κρυονερίτη, πάντα στο ίδιο σημείο και θόρυζε το λιβικό πέραγος και έλεγα του εαυτού μου, Γιώργη, αν τα καταφέρεις και δεν πιαστείς και δεν πιαστείς από τους Γερμανούς και δεν σε σκοτώσουνε και δεν σκοτώσεις και κανένα Γερμανό, έλεγα του εαυτού μου, θα είναι το μεγαλύτερο κατόρθωμα της ζωής σου. Δεν ήθελα να σκοτώσω τον Γερμανό. Δεν είχα ψυχή να σκοτώσω άνθρωπο.
The Germans did not find it easy to penetrate tight-knit family and village loyalties to recruit traitors and informers. But inevitably there were a few social outcasts who could be exploited. Memories of traitors and their activities are still a source of anger and shame. George Sikundakis, who was himself betrayed but managed to escape, remembers how 2 teenage boys from Castellos burnt a German plane and were denounced by a traitor. They gave themselves up when the Germans took 250 hostages and threatened to kill half of them. The youngest lad was sentenced to hard labor, while the others were sentenced to death.
Και τον λένε πως τον διαβάζουν τη θανατική καταδίκη. Και αν έχουν πράγμα να πούνε για τελευταία τον στιγμή. Λέει το ένα παιδί, λέει, εγώ θέλω ένα ποτήρι νερό, το σταυρουλάκι. Το άλλο λέει, εγώ θέλω ένα ποτήρι κρασί. Εδώ κατανιούς το νερό και από το δίπλα το καφέ, λένε μετά τα ρολές, τι είπες, εγώ είπα ένα ποτήρι κρασί, ένα ποτήρι και το βάρες στα πόδια. Και τον έστελνω και έκανε ζίκ-ζακ, του ρίξαν όλοι, δεν έβρε μια σφαίρα. Το άλλο για Ιράν τον έκανε η κοινά η χωριανή. Φύγε με κακό ριζικό, αφού ξαφνικά μοναχό. Φύγε. Εμείς δεν λέμε πως είδαμε να φεύγεις. Φύγε. Όχι, θα σκοτώσω πάλι τις δικού μας. Δεν φεύγω. Προτιμώ να σκοτώσω τις γονές μου και τους άλλους ανθρώπους. Δεν φεύγω. Γύρισα αυτή και το δανεκιά και κάτω και του ρίξαν όλοι και το κάμαν κομμάτια.
The most spectacular operation, mounted jointly by SOE and the Cretan resistance, occurred in the spring of 1944. One of the authors of the plan was the charismatic SOE leader, Patrick Lee Fermor.
Οι κριτικοί αγαπούν τους φίλους, την παρέα, το κρασάκι, και σε μια κρασοκατάνοιξη είπανε κοντά στη βίλα Αριάδνη που έμενε ο Γερμανός στρατηγός, ο Μίλερ όμως, όχι ο Κράιπε, ο Μίλερ, ο δήμιος του κριτικού λαού, ο οποίος έκαμε όλες τις εκτελέσεις μαζί με το Μπρόγερ στη Βιάνο και στα άλλα χωριά συνεχώς, στα χωριά της Κρήτης. Οπότε λέει να πάμε να απαγάγουμε τον στρατηγό.
It was intended by SOE as a mark of their disrespect for the German High Command, and was deliberately carried out as a counter-atrocity to atone to some extent for the atrocities that Miller had wreaked on the Cretan population.
Together with his SOE colleague Billy Moss, Lee Fermor hammered out the details of the plan. But before they could put it into effect, General Muller was replaced as military commander in Crete by General Kreipe of the 22nd Panzer Grenadier Division. They decided to go ahead anyway. Every day, Kreipe travelled between his home at the Villa Ariadne and his headquarters in Heraklion. The plan was to intercept his car at a road junction when he was returning home late in the evening. 2 Cretan spotters would signal ahead when the car approached. And on the evening of the 26th of April, it was put into effect.
The 2 SOE officers, wearing German uniform, opened the car doors, flung the driver out, got in, and one of them drove off, while the other stuck a knife into Kreipe's ribs, making sure that Kreipe kept his mouth shut. And Kreipe waved them through several German patrols. They then stopped the car on a remote bit of road, got out, set off separately, with Kreipe in one party and the driver in another, to get up into the hills and away.
Lee Fermor would then ditch the car with a note on the seat saying that it had been a British commando operation unaided by Cretans. But then came the problem of getting Kreipe off the island. The only way to achieve this was on foot, from Anoia up over Mount Ida and down to the south coast, moving by night across the grueling terrain and hiding in caves during the day. Their route took them through Yerakari, Pachos and Fortinu. It took 18 days.
Τον Κράιπε τον απάγα τον Απρίλη από το Ιράκ. Και όταν περάσα από τα Ανόγια, το φέρα το πιλότο, το πέρασαν ο μέρος Γερακάρι και ήρθε εδώ στο Χαλινόσπυλο. Και λέγανε εδώ το βράδυ, κατέβηκαν εδώ οι νεαροί, λέει, φέρανε εδώ μια νύφη. Εμείς σε καταλάβαμε πια το νύφη. Μετά τον πήρα από το πήγα στην Πατσό με ένα γάιδωρο από εδώ, γνούς πάνω χωριανού, τα Αλεξανδράκη. Και τον πήγα στο Βλακιά από εκεί τα μέρα και τον πήγαν για τη Μέση Ανατολή.
The Germans launched a massive manhunt, scouring the island for Kreipe and his captors.
Όπως είχαν ξεσηκώσει 2 μεραρχίες ολόκληρες και γυρεύαν τον στρατηγό Κράιπε. Και όταν πληροφορήσαν το δρομολόγιο, όλα τα χωριά που πέρασαν από το δρομολόγιο τα κατέστρεψαν, σκοτώσαν τον κόσμο και επέφεραν την καταστροφή.
Without the tacit knowledge and active help of hundreds of Cretan civilians and partisans, the task of keeping Kreipe hidden could never have been achieved.
Ένα βράδυ ήρθαν και μας ξυπνήσαν με τη νύφη μου και ήταν ένας από τα σφακιά που ήρθε και μας λέει φέρετε τίποτα γιατί φέρνω με τον Κράιπε και δεν έχουμε φάει τίποτα. Και κατεβήκαμε εμείς, πήραμε από το σπίτι ό,τι είχαμε και πήγαμε. Του Κράιπε του δώκαμε, δεν πήρε τίποτα. Τίποτα δεν έβαλε στο στόμα. Τον είχαν σε ένα μουλάρι καθισμένο, τον κράταγε ένας από εκεί που καθόταν και τον πήγαμε εμείς μέχρι τη βρύση. Ύστερα ήρθε ένα παιδί, Γιαννάκης Κουτελιδάκης, που ήταν και αδερφός του στην αντίσταση και αυτό, και τον πήγε στο βουνό. Έκατσε εκεί πέρα 2 μέρες.
Finally, on the night of the 14th of May, Kreipe was taken aboard the waiting motor launch from a beach near Rothakino. A guard of honour met him on the dock at Waterloo to pay the proper military compliments before he was taken into captivity. On Crete, German reaction to the successful abduction was predictable and savage.
Και αυτός τώρα πριν προδώσει το χωριό μας και κάψαν τα 7 χωριά του Αμαρίου, επίσης πέρασαν από όλα τα χωριά αυτά. Το χωριό μας σκοτώσαν 52 ονομάτους. 36 αμαζωμένους εδώ και τους άλλους σκορπιστούς γύρω-γύρω. Εγώ ούτε σε ένα πλάτα να πάνε, πήγα να φύγω, μα δεν μπόρεσα, ήταν κυκλωμένο το χωριό. Και βγήκα σε ένα πλάτα να πάνω, ήταν 50 μέτρα φυλάκιο και άλλα 50 την άλλη μεριά. Κατά τις 10 Γερμανοί χάσαμε. Στις 3 το απόγευμα άκουγα εδώ ρηπές του πολυγόλου, εδώ στο κατοχώρι. Αλλά εγώ νόμιζα πως παίζα στον αέρα, στη σκοποβολή Γερμανοί. Δεν ήξερα πως και τα ανθρώπους σκοτώναν.
As a rule, the impact of German reprisals was simply to make people angry. Much more often it made people angry than made them cowed. Compare the effect of the bombing of London. What did the bombing of London do? Made Londoners bloody furious. Bombing of Rotterdam cowed the Dutch entirely. Reprisals in Crete, ghastly though they were, made the Cretans more anti-German than ever.
The removal of Kreipe had very little military significance, and the brutal measures taken by the Germans against the Cretan population prompted harsh criticism of SOE. Allied victories in North Africa and Italy, coupled with the Normandy landings, gave a clear indication that their days in Crete were numbered. Cretans could begin to hope, but they would suffer further agonies before the end. In the autumn of 1944, once the balance of the war had swung decisively in favour of the Allies, German forces began to be withdrawn from Crete to defend the homeland. The only option left to the remaining forces of occupation was to abandon Heraklion and Rethymno and fall back on Hania. In preparation for this, they launched a campaign of preemptive terror that was designed to counter the threat of attack along their exposed flank by partisan groups. More villages were burnt and civilians murdered.
Λοιπόν, σε αυτή τη γειτονιά πέρα ήταν 7 αγόρια. 2 αδέρφια, 1 μοναχοπέδι και 4 άλλα αδέρφια, τα οποία τα σκοτώσανε όλα. Από τα 4 εγκλήωσε 1, το οποίο έλειπε. Ήταν 5. Άλλο ήταν ότι πιάσανε και 1, το οποίο λένε ότι του βρήκαν ένα μαντίλι και ήταν γερμανικό. Αυτοί, λέει, το θεωρήσανε ότι ίσως να πήγε εκεί πέρα που χτυπήσαν τις Γερμανούς και το πήρε και τον διαμελήσαν, του κάμανε πολλά βασανιστήρια. Και πέρα τον βρήκαν μετά 8 μέρες.
The soldiers showed no mercy and no respect to their victims. In the same village, a young partisan, or andarte, was captured with a knapsack containing ammunition.
Τον πήραν λοιπόν, τον σέρνανε σε απόσταση 200 με 300 και τον εκκρεμάσαν σε μια χλάβα, βγάλανε τα δόντια χρυσά ότι είχε με τη ξυφολόγη, δεν ξέρω τι άλλο βασανιστήρια. Υπάρχει το μνημείο το δικό του εκεί πέρα.
The period while the Germans were abandoning the towns to the east of Hania sharpened the tensions and animosities between the various resistance groups. The prospect of a German defeat brought into sharp focus the question of who would hold power. In mainland Greece, the communist EAM-ELAS resistance was locked in a savage struggle with groups whose affiliations were to the centre and right wing of the political spectrum. This was to result in a murderous civil war that persisted for several years after the defeat of Germany and was to have a profound effect on the future course of Greek history. This conflict was reflected in Crete, not in its worst aspects. In part, this was due to the mediating influence of SOE, although the communist groups resisted attempts to organise them and acted independently throughout the occupation.
One of the achievements of the British Secret Services in Crete was to persuade all the Cretans to work together against the common enemy, so that the civil war that ravaged Greece from 1943 to about 1949, hardly had any part in Crete at all. This was because some of the British agents there had personalities like sledgehammers and could compel even Cretans to behave as they wished against somebody whom everybody could recognise as a manifest enemy.
Another unifying factor was the strong republican sentiment of the Cretan population. It found expression in EOK, the nationalist resistance movement that was supported by SOE and acted as an umbrella for the non-communist groups. Although clashes between EOK and EAM-ELAS became increasingly bloody towards the end, the island was spared the worst effects of the Civil War. On the 8th of May 1944, the commander of the German forces on Crete, General Bentag, signed the surrender document. As to be expected, there was dancing in the streets. Traitors and collaborators were quickly rounded up and received little mercy. SOE's job was done, and most of the British officers and agents left the island shortly afterwards. For many young Cretans, victory over the Germans did not bring release. Many were drafted into the army to fight in the civil war that had erupted on the mainland and was not finally resolved until 1949. But in the referendum of September 1946, Cretans stood out against the mainland in rejecting the return of the monarchy, whilst also decisively rejecting communism. Once again, the islanders had shown the fierce independence that had made them such formidable enemies to the invaders.